Hi and welcome to this video about ethnicity and differences in achievement. So the question we're looking at with this topic is, with reference to an item, evaluate the view that external factors lead to underachievement for some ethnic groups. You can use the knowledge in this question that we're going to discuss for a question about internal factors. You need to rephrase and reword your answer, but it's very detailed what we're going to go through. So the first thing to say is there are marked differences in educational underachievement. Some minority ethnic groups do much better than others. So you could refer to the National Pupil Database, which conducted research on pupils' achievement from different ethnic groups in 2013, and the results showed that nearly 80% of Chinese and nearly 80% of Indian students achieved 5 or more GCSE grades at A stars to C, including English and Maths, while Pakistani, Black Caribbean and Gypsy or Roma pupils finished well below the 60% national average. So you got that statistic. Now there are several explanations that I would give in my introduction after I've given that statistic. Firstly, there's the argument that external factors outside school and outside education, found in the culture of communities and families, is the cause of differences in achievement. So we could talk about issues like parenting style, peer pressure and family structure. And this is what we could call and also you could refer to language and speech codes. So this is what we call the cultural deprivation approach, and thinkers like Sewell have applied these kind of cultural deprivation arguments to ethnicity and differences in achievement. Other sociologists argue that external issues are to blame, but they take a more critical approach. So they're more critical of society as a whole. So they focus on issues like wider issues of racism, institutional racism in education. And so thinkers like Gilbourne talk about racism in terms of within education and across wider society. Now, racism can lead to poverty, and so you can argue that material deprivation is one of the causes of differences in achievement. However, that can be criticised because many students from minority backgrounds achieve success despite poverty, which suggests that culture is still an important factor. Lastly, there's the processes within the school. So there's the labelling of students based on racial stereotypes, which can lead to stigmatisation or negative labelling. It can lead to disciplining of students because of those kinds of assumptions, which is different disciplining from other students, higher level of exclusions for black minority ethnic students as well. You can also talk about the relationship between factors outside the school and within the school, so the way in which students' identities may conflict with the kind of culture within the school. You could also talk about subcultures as well. So there's a number of studies that you could mention with all of these views. So first of all, let's look at external factors. And one of the key arguments from Sewell is about peer pressure and family structure. So there's more detail in the book about that on page 38 and 39. But the argument in criticism of what Sewell says is that it's not peer pressure, but it's actually institutional racism within education, and it's a racist labelling of black students that explains differences in achievement. So you have some criticisms there to actually explain. You can talk about this from a critical perspective, and you can say, whereas Sewell is adopting a cultural deprivation approach, where he's arguing that people need certain values to be successful, and that the problem is the family and the peer group are providing the wrong values to young children from black and some South Asian backgrounds. The critical approach with thinkers like Gilborn is arguing that is blaming the victims of inequality, it's underestimating problems like poverty, and it's ignoring problems like institutional racism, where the way in which students are assessed is rigged. So they're basically black students are more likely to fail because of the way they're assessed by teachers who are already assuming that they're not got the ability to succeed. And this means that teachers will set up assessments which tend to disadvantage those students. And so students are less likely to be selected and less likely to go on to succeed in education. You can argue that material deprivation is an issue. So due to racism in wider society and issues of poverty that result from racism, you can argue that some students from some minority ethnic backgrounds are more likely to be suffering from poverty, and this will have an effect on their experience of education. You can give some facts for that from a section on page 40, material deprivation and class. Okay, so you can argue in contrast to that view that social class factors do not override the effects of culture, because even when social class and poverty is taken into account, students still achieve success from the poorest backgrounds. So it can be that factors like religious values, cultural beliefs and attitudes, such as the aspiration to achieve more, the aspiration to move on in life, to get professional jobs and so on, that those values can be powerful in enabling people to overcome poverty and achieve success despite poverty. For example, the bottom of page 40 in the bottom right, there's some facts that 86% of Chinese girls who receive free school meals achieve 5 or more higher grade GCSEs, compared with only 65% of white girls who were not receiving free school meals. So those Chinese girls are doing better even though they're suffering more poverty than the white girls. Madood also found that children from low-income families generally did less well, but the effects of low income were much less for other ethnic groups than for white pupils. So again, there seems to be a cultural issue. So from a cultural deprivation perspective, there do seem to be some issues with the beliefs and attitudes in some groups. And this is evidenced by the fact that despite poverty, so some students are still able to succeed thanks to those values. You could talk about parental support. So there's a study by McCulloch from 2014 about ethnic minority pupils aspiring to go to university. There's a study by Lupton, which is similar, poorer behaviour in white working class schools. Okay, with less poverty, but actually poorer levels of discipline. And again, parental support was blamed as the reason for that. So it could be to do with the aspirations of students from ethnic minority families, where they're more ambitious about going on in life to reach high-level professional jobs, better incomes, better educational results. However, you can criticise that argument. You can say that it overlooks the economic barriers that students face. So, for example, McCallum and Demi took advantage of the availability of census data at local authority level to show that GCSE performance correlated with social class and levels of home ownership, and negatively with other measures that included unemployment, social deprivation and overcrowding. In other words, the more people were unemployed, the more they were likely to experience lower levels of GCSE performance. So that's a negative correlation, because the higher the unemployment, the lower the educational success. So that suggests parental support is only part of the picture. You can't only blame parental support, you also need to take into account external factors like poverty. There's also the cultural deprivation view about language and about the lack of intellectual stimulation and intellectual skills in some low-income black families. So Barita and Engelman talk about the language of low-income black American families as inadequate for educational success. They see it as ungrammatical, disjointed, and incapable of expressing abstract ideas. So that's a cultural deprivation view where people are unable to develop thinking skills due to the lack of language where they're encouraged to develop those skills from a young age. If you compare that with middle class, successful, students, parents who encourage them to be questioning and to self-reflect and self-evaluate, they're always encouraged to think beyond what they know and think in abstract terms as well, so think about ideas like philosophy, democracy and ideology. These are abstract ideas because they're not physical, but they are intellectual ideas that you have to be able to imagine, and that's what abstract means. So in criticism of that theory, Jeffrey Driver argues that cultural deprivation theory ignores the positive effects on ethnicity and achievement. The Black Caribbean family, instead of being dysfunctional and providing weak intellectual thinking skills, actually provides strong role models, especially for girls from Black Caribbean backgrounds. And that could suggest why girls are more successful in education than black boys. This does suggest that cultural differences do affect achievement, but it does suggest that cultural deprivation theory is too negative about black culture. You can also criticise cultural deprivation theory for victim blaming. So Keddy in 1973 talks about the way in which they're not culturally deprived but culturally different, students from black backgrounds and working class backgrounds. So the issue is more to do with the school and the racism and the kind of prejudice within schools where teachers will not support students. So Gilbourne and Udell reinforce this because they say that teachers had racialized expectations in their study. What that meant is that the teachers had expectations where they assumed students would be challenging, threatening, they might threaten the authority of the teacher. And this in turn led to conflict with teachers and obviously a lack of support, not pushing the students academically, and leads to lower levels of achievement. So again, cultural deprivation theory can be seen as ignoring processes within schools because it emphasises what's happening outside the school in terms of families and communities, and it ignores processes that disadvantage students within the school. It's also worth mentioning that the relationships between the external factors and the internal factors are important. So teachers with racialised expectations are seeing students, they're identifying the students' skin colour, their culture in terms of possibly other aspects of the student's identity like their clothing. So for example, the study by Archer et al., that's on page 33 and 32 and 34, those studies are about working class young people, and it's about how the students constructed meaningful class identities for themselves based on brands like Nike. And teachers would see that, they'd see the students' skin colour, the brands, and they would identify those students as possibly influenced by street styles, possibly threatening, even rebels to authority. And therefore this would be where the relationship between the pupil's identity and how they present themselves and the teacher and the school's habitus or set of cultural expectations and attitudes, they would clash, there'd be a conflict, and the students would experience what we call symbolic violence. So this is where students are devalued and their identity is given less prestige compared to the middle class white students, and therefore again this would lead to underachievement And students would also see higher education as unrealistic and undesirable, and that would have a knock-on effects on their levels of effort and motivation with GCSE. So overall, in conclusion, you could argue that there's many problems with emphasising external factors, especially in terms of the culture of groups. And you could certainly argue that this ignores wider problems in terms of economic inequalities and racism in society. And you could also argue that internal processes within the school are important, and the relationship between the outside factors, identity, and the relationships within the school and labelling are very important. So a focus only on external factors to explain ethnic differences in achievement would be inadequate and incomplete. So I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions, let me know at dbutcherbmet@gmail.com.